Class, good morning. Um, Please, I'm gradually waiting for those who class. Please, are you with me? Well, good morning. Today we'll be examining social perception as one of the topics we are to examine. Social perception. Please, as you join us, kindly help me click likes and if you can hear me clearly, please always try as much as possible to indicate so we'll know if the network is okay or we need to do something different. Now, we have said it in the field of sociology several times that anywhere you see the word social, we are generally talking about a society. Under the concept of social perception, we are going to examine um, the introduction. We will examine the concept of social perception itself, and we'll also look at the excuse me we'll also look at the different channels of verbal communication, and under that we examine Darwin's theory of universal facial expression of emotion. You know, it is a well documented fact that human beings are social animals. It is a documented fact that human beings are social animals. And their survival is contingent on their ability to interact with one another. That's why in the field of sociology we say sociology is the scientific study of human behavior and society. This means that every mode of survival, whatever you are going to become as a member of the society, is going to be contingent on your ability to interact, to talk, to discuss with other members of the society. Because naturally, human beings are predisposed to knowing about other people's personality, whether you like it or not. And this is one of the factors that have made some of us relate with others or deal with them amicably. You know, social psychology is that field that deals with the scientific analysis of human behavior, the influence of other people's way of life on your own personal life. Social psychologists try to explain how the thoughts, feelings, you know, and behaviors of individuals are influenced by the presence of other people in their lives. The question is now, those people you move with, in what ways have they been able to have influence on the things you do? Of what importance is social cognition? Now we'll be examining how our experience is understood in terms of the social influences and relationships that we tend to gain within the cultural groups that we belong. Therefore, what do we mean by social perception? In some textbooks, you may come across social perception and cognition. And both social perception and social cognition are mental processes that helps us to collect and remember information about others. Class, please, are you with me? If you can hear me clearly, please signify. I repeat that social perception and cognitions are mental processes that helps us to collect and remember information about others. Not only that, also to make inferences and judgments based on that information that we have gotten. So, social perception is defined as the study of how people form impressions of and make inferences about other people. So, social perception just involves the impressions you have built about people. You have your perception of me, who I am. And I equally have this perception of whom some of you are. But how do you test the social realities of those perceptions? That's where the problem lies. That is why you have to just be objective with everybody you deal with. May our loyalty never be tested, for instance. You work under me, I've heard a lot of things about you, and I am to say certain things about you. What if those things are not right? Even despite the fact that we tend to gather and remember information about others. How? Therefore, we often rely on information that we gain from people's physical appearance, how they talk, that's their verbal and non-verbal communication. But no matter what you do, you can't get really you can you it's always very difficult to get adequate information about people. So because of that, the missing informations that you do not have about people are filled in. You fill the gap by using your own implicit personality theory, which implies that if a person is observed to have one particular trait, we assume that he or she has traits related to the observed one. Please, class, as we move further, try to ask your questions and put them in the comment section, please. Make sure you ask your questions, please. Now, these assumptions now helps us to categorize people and their, let me say, additional facts. Then you now use that to predict their behavior. But social perceptions are very and well connected with or to self perception because both are influenced by self motives. And society, society has the desire to achieve beneficial outcomes for oneself and to maintain a positive self image. Just as you prejudge people, eh? Just as you prejudge people that you come across in the society, you are also being judged by them. Yes, you are equally being judged by them. So, as it is natural for humans to want to make a good impression on people, your self perceptions almost mirror other social perceptions. That can be found in the works of Tuna and Richard in 2017. In the works of David Craig and Richard S. Crutchfield, there are two major determinants of perception. Two major determinants of perception. One is the structural factors and functional factors. I said in the works of David Craig and Richard S. Crutchfield, there are just two determinants of perception: the structural factors and the functional factors. Please, class, if you can hear me well, please. This is unfair now. I have 112 students. I they sit at 5 likes. Better they click on. Anyway, that aside. Let's continue our teaching. Now, what do we mean by structural factors? What do we mean by structural factor? We are talking about those factors that are derived solely from the nature of physical stimuli and the natural effects that they evoke in the nervous system of every individual. Remember, in our biological basis of behavior, I told you that the things that control our biological basis is genetic variations, hormones, and the nervous system, where we have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Therefore, most of our perceptions about people are pushed by the stimuli. Favor said I should repeat it again. What? Please state exactly what you want me to repeat, please. Please kindly state exactly what you want me to repeat. Okay, structural factor. I said that structural factor are those factors that are derived solely from the nature and physical, stimuli and the natural effects they evoke in the nervous system of every individual. Therefore, our perceptual organizations are only determined primarily by the psychological events occurring in our nervous system as individuals. And it gives a direct reaction to the stimulation by the physical objects. Because, sensory factors are independent, of the perceiving individual needs and personality. Therefore, it is always important to understand that most of our perceptions, especially when it comes to structural factors, arise from how we stimulate, or the kind of stimulation that goes on within our nervous system. Trendybeats.com. Now, We have the functional factors. What are the functional factors? We are talking about factors that are derived primarily from the needs, mood, past experience, and memory of every individual. Because all the functional factors in perception are social in the user's sense of term. Now, social perception is one important component of social competence and to live a successful social life. What do we mean by being competent in social perception? This has just three domains. I said social perception is one of the important components of social competence and successful social life. Your social perception is definitely going to shape your social life. Remember last week, while we were talking about factors that shape attitude, we spoke about experience and perception. In fact, perception was the last factor that we examined. Therefore, it is important we take cognizance of how we perceive things, how we see things, how we view things. We don't just say things, we must be very objective. We must be very critical. Now, we have said that social perception is just one important component of social competence and successful social life. So, what does it imply? It implies that being a competent person in social perception includes three domains of competence. Number one, you have to know and recognize that other people have thoughts, emotions, beliefs, intentions, and other things. That's number one. People have emotion. Nobody is superhuman. We all have emotion. I would say he's a professor. They annoyed him and he was shouting. No, nobody is super when it comes to emotion. Nobody. Number two, you should be able to read other people's inner states. But that's very difficult. How do you read people's mind? You must be able to read other people's inner states based on their words, behavior, facial expressions, and the likes. When you talk to people, their facial expression alone says a lot about their intention. It's just an example of trying to send a younger one on errand. The facial expression alone signifies whether such person is willing to do such tasks or such person is feeling reluctant to do it. Number three, you have to adjust your own action based on those readings. Therefore, this is where the social component comes in because you must be socially competent to be able to take note of other people's facial expression, tone of their voice, their posture, their gesture, words, and the likes. But this must be based on clues that you have reasonably gathered, you know, to make judgment about that person's state of mind. Therefore, as a socially competent person, you must be able to use the inferences I've mentioned earlier on, you know, about other people's inner states to make good decisions about how to behave socially. Therefore, socially competent people must have knowledge of social rules. If you are socially competent, you must have adequate knowledge of social rules and regulations. Roles, the functions to perform, routines, and every other thing involved in your social life. And as a socially competent person, you must be able to make use of knowledge, the knowledge you have gathered about people critically to take certain decisions. Various researchers over the years have confirmed that first impressions are very important. Yeah. Rita Success said, by also being very observant, some people can hide very. Yes, of course. You're a human. You use your natural, native, and basic intelligence, to control event of things. Because that's how it works. Like I said earlier on, that researchers have opined that first impressions are very important. And studies show that first impressions are easily formed and at the same time difficult to change because it has a long lasting influence. So, rather than absorbing each piece of new information about an individual in a new vacuum, it is now a common thing for people to invoke a pre existing prototype of impressions that they have about people. Let's take, for instance, if there is no special reason to think negatively about a person, your first impression of that person would normally be positive. You won't have any issue with such person. But as people tend to give others benefit of doubts, issues begin. And we begin to have reservations for people. However, there are people who are very attentive to negative factors. They don't see anything good in you. Yeah, said the first impression sometimes doesn't define a person's personality. That is if you have chance or chances to continue to interact with them. Like I said, that people are very attentive to negative factors, and if negative factors are always present, they will always outweigh the positive ones and generate wrong impressions about you. So one reason first impressions are so indelible in that people have a tendency to interpret new information about a person in a light that will reinforce their first impression. There is nothing you can do about it. Now let's look at stereotypes. Because one of the major problems people face in their society is stereotyping. Stereotypes can be said to be beliefs, impressions about people based on their membership in a particular group. Stereotype can be positive, it can be negative, or at the same time neutral. So stereotypes are based on gender, ethnicity, occupation, and some other factors. But stereotypes have very important functions. They allow people to quickly process new information about event or a person. Two, they organize people's past experiences. Three, it helps people grow, and it equally helps them to meaningfully assess differences between individuals and groups. It equally helps people to make predictions, you know, about other people's behavior. But stereotype can lead to distortions of reality for several reasons. It causes people to exaggerate differences among groups. The exaggeration becomes too much. It leads people to focus on selective information, you know, that agrees with the stereotype and ignore information that disagrees with the stereotype. It equally tends to make people see other groups as overly homogeneous, even though people can easily see that group they belong to as heterogeneous. However, there are so what people are parallel. All this voice from. There are channels of non-verbal communication because it is very important we examine this. Under stereotype, non-verbal communication is one of the many interesting topics that is studied by psychologists. Non-verbal communication takes place in every social setting, though it's not often recognized for what it is for, what it means, because it makes up a substantial portion of our process of communication. Number one, Strike Kelly said, how do you change an already existing negative impression? It takes a long time to clear a negative impression, and it all depends on the nature of activities that are involved in such impression. So, number one of the different channels of non-verbal communication, like I said, most of many of us associate facial expression and gestures with non-verbal communication, but these are not only the two types that are involved. In fact, there are in fact about eight or thereabouts. Number one is facial expression. Facial expression makes up the largest proportion of non-verbal communication because large amount of information can be conveyed through a smile or a frown. Someone like me will say, I'm not friendly, I don't smile. And it's a facial impression, and it forms part of my life. It forms part of what you may use to. The facial expression for happiness, sadness, anger, and fear are similar across culture throughout the world. If you see somebody that is angry, facial expression. Somebody that is happy, it is everywhere in the world. So it's formed part of our non-verbal. Number two is gesture. Common gestures like pointing, waving, and using fingers, etc. You can tell a person's attitude by the way they walk, or by the way they stand, or let me say, a lot of things are involved. There is also body language and posture. Your body language and posture, your movement can also convey a great deal of information. For example, you are talking to someone and you cross your leg. It conveys a different meaning depending on the context and the people or the person's interpret or the people interpreting them. Therefore, body language is very subtle and may not be very definitive. We have also eye gaze. You look at people, you stare at them, you blink. All these are considered types of eye gaze. Looking at one another person can indicate a range of emotions, including hostility, interest, or attraction. So, eye behaviors play a very important role, when it's, or let me just say, several important roles in communication. Your appearance, even your choice of color, clothing, hairstyle, and other factors affect your appearance. They are also considered as a means of non-verbal communication. Then, to cap it, I would like to examine Charles Darwin's theory of universal facial expression of emotion. How exactly do we convey our emotions to others? One obvious way we have of doing this is by making specific facial expressions. So we smile when we're happy, we frown when we're angry, and we may even appear tearful when we are sad. So it is remarkable that relatively small movements of your body, your face, can convey a whole lot of meanings to people. Charles Darwin happens to be the first person to suggest that main facial expressions are universal. He wrote a book, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, in 1872. He examined the facial behavior of non-human primates in order to find out about their origins of expressions in man. And he chose this comparison with primates, for they were closer to the relatives to the ancestors of man and had to be therefore similar to them. Say monkeys, they look like human beings. Well. And according to Charles Darwin's belief in that research, in the principles of evolution, I, Charles Darwin's theory of universal facial expression of emotion. Charles Darwin's theory of universal facial expression of emotion. So, as I was explaining, he chose primates because they were the closest to, you know, to man and how to be therefore studied. So, according to the belief he gathered as at that time, those primates can give a clue about the origin and development of facial movement. So, in his findings were based on his own personal observation as well as the observations of zookeepers who relate directly with those primates. And the result was that some facial expressions of non human primates are similar to those of humans, including expression of anger, happiness, and sadness. But although we share these expressions with them, they do not always have the same functions with humans. For example, he went further by saying, the expression of man, the expression of happiness in man, a development of the grimace that monkeys have used to signalize fear. So, it is therefore interesting to note that he did not only describe the various and different emotional expression in man and animals alone, he also attempted to explain the reason for the association of a particular expression with a specific emotion. For instance, why we blush when we are embarrassed, or why we make a characteristic mouth movement when disgusted. The evidence is that when you blush when you are embarrassed, it's almost the same thing everywhere. Therefore, facial expressions are universal and they are for specific emotions. Modern researchers have also, in fact, they suggested that Charles Darwin was right for the six major emotional expressions he pointed out: anger, happiness, surprise, fear, disgust, and sadness. Number one, for example, face. Face. If you express something on your face, it reveals your current mood and feelings. Your eye contact either signifies friendliness, shyness, or aggression. Your body language, possibly position, posture, and movement, reveals emotional state, your social status, and cultural emblems. Touching may reveal affection, interest, dominance, caring, threat, and aggression. He further investigated the functions of facial expression. What exactly do we use facial expression for? And he concluded that facial expressions, as simple as it may look, especially in non-human primates, represents what it almost feels in human. Additionally, Charles Darwin investigated the determinants of facial expression and defined them along universal principles. The first is the principle of serviceable associated habits, which implies that behaviors that are performed consciously in order to survive becomes unconscious with a certain state of mind. Therefore, Charles Darwin argued that emotional expressions are adaptive responses. They communicate internal states of every human, send out signals that enemies are present and have a powerful survival value for many species. Because once the primate sights you, their own facial expression that looks like we smile in human, they also represent fear. So Darwin's primary interest was in describing facial expressions and demonstrating that they are linked to the same emotions in human creature. Class, we have tried till we meet online again for further lecture. Thank you.